Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm so happy to be in Canada. A lot of things happening in my country right now that concern me, so it feels great. I'm thinking about how my ancestors must have felt, the ones who made their way across the border to Canada. Then it's actually eerie to think about how history repeats itself and why this conversation is such an important part of the work to make sure that we can make a world where all of us can express ourselves freely. So before we get started, I want to know when I need to be done, because I can go off on a roll. So I want to make sure that I know exactly when I need to. You'll let me know. Okay, cool. Don't be shy about it. And we'll get ready to go. So the reason that we're having this conversation is because, as many of you know, if you're online harassment, the targeting of women, people of color, queer people, disabled people, immigrants, has become so pernicious that oppressed groups who speak up online have been experiencing harassment and hatred at crisis levels. And I'm wondering, has anyone in this room ever experienced online harassment? If you feel comfortable raising your hand or know somebody who has. It's unfortunate that the majority of us have experienced it or know somebody who has. And even in this moment, now that, especially in my country, we're watching the 45th president tweeting every day and harassing people, it's amazing how commonplace it's become and how it's becoming normalized. So before I get into showing you a video that talks about why we work on this issue and why it's so important, I wanted to say that when I just arrived yesterday, I was just sharing this with the team this morning. The customs agent who welcomed me into Canada said, "What are you doing here? What's going to happen?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to University of Ottawa. I'm super excited. It's my first time coming to Ottawa. I'm going to be talking about online harassment." And he said, "What is online harassment? I don't know about that. Is that a thing?" And I said, "Oh, it's very much a thing. I'd love to talk with you about it right now." And he was very curious and interested in solutions. So I told him some of the things that my organization and our coalition has been able to do to change policy at places you might have heard of, like Facebook and Twitter. And he said, "Oh, that must not have been easy." And I said, "Oh, it wasn't, and there are ways and tactics that I'm going to share with you now that you can help compel these companies to do the right thing." And he said, "Well, I hope you're prioritizing compelling your president to get off Twitter." And I said, "Oh, Canada, I love you." So now I'm going to show you this video. And it is a video that was recorded probably a little bit closer to this time last year. I want to make sure that I'm... Online harassment looks like intimidation,
name-calling,
threats,
exertion of power and control,
non-consensual pornography,
humiliation. I hope you never have children so you don't add more stupidity to the gene pool.
Pretty much any variation of you feminazi bitch that you can think of.
You deserve to die. You should be pistol whipped and raped. You should be beaten until the lights go out and you can never speak again.
Online harassment feels scary.
It feels like an undermining of my human dignity.
It's a constant drumbeat of hostility.
People aren't aware of the impact that it has.
It dehumanizes the people that you're attacking.
You're a cunt and a bitch and you should die.
You are no fun at parties.
Let's see how smart you are.
This woman has no place in Pakistan. She is bringing bad name to Islam and to our country.
I have a knife and a dick and one of them's going to go into you.
The online harassment problem needs to be addressed with the same sort of force that we need to address offline harassment.
We should be able to speak freely. The people building technology need to think about everyone who's going to be using it.
If someone says, "I'm experiencing harassment online," ask what they mean.
We have to get people to pause, to stop, and to think about what they're really saying.
So that video was taped at an online harassment session at South by Southwest that had to be fought for, that there was actually discussion about whether or not we should even be having conversations about online harassment, whether the movement to end online harassment was a movement to promote censorship. And what we're offering, and what is the ethos, thank you, of what we're doing is actually about creating more spaces where all of us can speak freely. That the movement to end online harassment, in contrast to the accusation that it's a censorship movement, is actually a movement of free expression. And one of the things that resulted from our participation in the South by Southwest Forum was that President Obama actually happened to be there. President Obama, just taking a deep breath. President Obama actually happened to be there during the South by Southwest that we were presenting at. And although he was not a part of our experience that day, he did later that week speak about online harassment when talking about issues that needed to be prioritized around free speech in this country and in America. And I see that as a major win, that the frame that we've been working on within our coalition for several years to transform it from a conversation around free speech and censorship, which is still being used to promote hate speech, was used by our then president to say that we need to prioritize ending online harassment just as much as we prioritize public safety for all people and ending violence against women. And so that was a major monumental moment that didn't get as much press coverage as I would have liked, but that I think is really important to think about why this work is important and why it's important to educate people about the need for culture shift. So the first thing I want to talk about is why WWAM, now that you know what we focus on and do. And my organization, Women Action in the Media, doesn't just focus on online harassment. We're working to make media accessible for all people to participate in and to also increase ownership in media for women, people of color, and other disenfranchised groups. But the reason why this issue came to us is that a large part of our membership are media activists, journalists, people who are getting harassed every day for speaking their minds and for also holding the truth to the light, which is giving me chills in this moment because with conversations around alternative facts and post-truth happening in my country, it's even more important that people feel like they can be safe about truth-telling and telling authentic stories. And so we got to a point where enough was enough, that doxing, violent threats, all of the forms of online harassment that are most egregious were targeting people of color and disproportionately targeting women. And so we grew out of our Speech and Safety Coalition a Twitter project where we decided that we were going to come together with groups of advocacy organizations to work with social media companies and ensure that women and gender nonconforming people would have access to both free speech and also safety online. And we collected data through a pilot project that later became some research that I'll talk to you about later, which was called Reporting, Reviewing, and Responding to Harassment on Twitter. And those research-based recommendations and solutions ended up being used to design some systemic changes to Twitter and other platforms. But first, before that happened, we had decided that something needed to be done about Facebook. And some of this work happened when I was still a volunteer at WWAM, and we had another leader who was founder Jacqueline Friedman. And in partnership with our board member, Soraya Shamali, they decided, what are we going to do about the fact that we are being exposed to violent, egregious domestic violence images on Facebook, that we are seeing rape imagery, racist, hateful imagery that is algorithmically spread throughout this platform. We were told that we were crazy, shrill women, delicate flowers, and that there was nothing that we could do about it. And what happened is that we just decided that if no one else was going to take us seriously, that we needed to use the tools that we had at our disposal to take action. Because women only have 5% of the media licenses in the world. So what we do have is people power, and that is what we decided to leverage. So we have this picture of David and Goliath, which I know might seem odd for a feminist to talk, but the metaphor is a great one. Ours is a story of not knowing what power we had until we decided to act. And ours is a story of speaking truth to power and using networking, which was also something that we were able to use with a limited budget. So here's the problem. At the time, Facebook said, nope, no images of breastfeeding, But yes, you could have images of domestic violence and women who've been battered. No, can't have pictures of reconstructive surgery. But yes, rape jokes are totally okay with our community standards of free speech. So in seeing that, we really realized, okay, this is actually an issue around misogyny and rape culture being so deeply embedded that there's more force to protect the right for people to promote harm than there is to ensure that women can talk about their health and safety online. So the hashtag FBRape campaign was born. And this campaign was really a campaign, and I should trigger warn anyone here, I'm going to show some graphic images. This campaign was born from the idea that a lot of the advertisers who support Facebook would promote a pain point for Facebook if they were aware of the kind of material that was being put next to their products and their ads. That those associations would therefore speak to them and their values, which would be their profit and their bottom line. Because before, when we were being told we were shrill and censoring, appealing to conscience didn't work. And one of my Black feminist foremothers, Ida B. Wells, had often said that too in the anti-lynching movement, where she had said, appeals to the white man's conscience at that time have done far less than appeals to his pocketbook and purse. So I thought a lot about that in terms of how the Facebook rape campaign and our later Twitter campaign worked out, because this was also true in movements for gender equality online. So here's one problematic example of the kinds of content that was completely protected under the community standards of Facebook at that time. This image was another example that was protected on Facebook at this time, an image evoking misogyny and child abuse, and was one that had been reported and been allowed to stay up under the guise of free speech. And so you can see here that we have access to all of those advertisers. And so what we did is to bring together a global coalition with images like these, send out 60,000 tweets and 900 emails, with lots of other phone calls and caucuses that happened in between, to talk to people who are affected around the world so that we could say, if you felt like this is okay to see, then why was it okay for you to make a business decision to take down the beheading videos that Facebook decided were not content suitable for their platform? Why is it were you empowered to take that down immediately? Why is it did you use the idea that you are a public institution, or private institution, to protect you in that case, but that you still feel like it's okay for this sort of graphic imagery to remain online? And so what we did with a handful of organizations is to get 10 signers here and abroad. We had Laura Bates at Everyday Sexism, some people might also know of her work, to design this flip the switch model, as we call it. And while we were in the process of negotiations with higher ups at Facebook, we were also engaged in developing website communications, strategies, social media, and various time zones at the 100 organizations around the country that were doing this work, so that we could be talking to these advertisers and also gaining numbers of support for the campaign 24/7 until something was done. And this one global feminist network, all of the phone calls, Google Hangouts, and online chats ended up in resulting in a change of policy. So what I want to say about that is that we did learn that even though we didn't have the ownership, we didn't have the direct access at first to some of the major change makers at organizations like Facebook, that being able to raise our voices using the very tools that were being leveraged to harm us was the way that we were able to make change. Now, what I'd like to say is that I've been going to my ancestors a lot at this time in our history, and Coretta Scott King's advice that struggle has to be won and fought in every single generation has come back. So we did win, and Facebook did make a change to their community standards. But now we're seeing that there's still problems with problematic content, specifically as it relates to race, that are completely prevalent on Facebook's platform. I myself have reported a lot of harassment that I've received. There was one the other day that I reported that was some anti-Islamic hate speech and anti-Muslim and also anti-Black hate speech. I was told that it was not a violation of community standards to target someone by calling them a sand N-word. And that is unacceptable to me, that they would say this isn't a violation of community standards. I did notice that it said, I could understand why this could be offensive to you in the response that I received from Facebook, which to me felt like more salt in the wound. So the lesson from what we have just discussed is that we have to continue to remain vigilant, and we have to stay woke, as the movement for Black Lives would say it, as we continue to do this work. Because if we don't stay on watch, these things will continue to happen. And one of the things that's really important for us to talk about now is that after the election in the United States, Facebook has hired on some people in its news team who are more conservative to reflect the face of the new administration. And so when we look at that and the fact that one of the United States president's key advisors was also a leader at Breitbart News, who is a promoter of hate speech, and also a lot of the people who read Breitbart are also perpetuators of online harassment and Facebook and other spaces, that we now are in an environment that's even tougher terrain to make this kind of change because it's being normalized. So one of the things that I think I would be remiss in not saying is that for us to take wins like the one that we had and not continue to use those relationships and also build our networks to continue to push back would result in our peril, because there's going to be a lot of work that's going to be undone if we don't stay vigilant. One example of that is the fact that Breitbart right now, you might have heard about this, has had 800 advertisers pull out from advertising from them. And I would like to think that the success of the Facebook rape campaign is one of the reasons why this new campaign, which we didn't start, but I love, was able to happen. And the tactic of using advertisers and sending them these images with their companies being attached to messaging that's harmful has been really helpful. One thing I wanted to mention is that since you're in Canada, I have to do this for call to action. I noted that Shopify is one of the companies that has been refusing to pull advertising from Breitbart, along with Uber and Amazon. So that's another way that we can continue this work, is to hold them accountable too. And if you are a customer at Shopify, to let them know and to send them the screenshots of offensive content and let them know that we're not going to take it. So another thing that we did that came after the Facebook rape campaign is that we had this network of people that we could continue to activate. And one of the things that we kept hearing back was that so many people were feeling like by being outspoken about online harassment, the backlash that ensued was that they were getting even more online harassment or even more egregious attacks. And we really went back to these companies and said, we are hearing about women being disproportionately targeted. We're hearing that not only are the statistics that we're hearing that 25% of young women are being attacked online or sexually harassed online, we're hearing from our constituents that they're not just getting attacked and harassed, but they are having their public information shared, that cyber sexual exploitation or revenge porn, as a lot of people know it, is being used to harass and intimidate people. And one of the things we were told is, well, we can't really do anything unless we have data to support it. And so, thank you. So we did independent third-party audit because we had at that point had authorization through Twitter to kind of be able to get information from users about their experiences online. And as an authorized reporter, what we did was to help escalate these reports, help vet through Twitter what the real online harassment reports were, and to also identify those that weren't. And what came out of that was the report that I mentioned, reporting, reviewing, and responding to harassment on Twitter, as well as a series of infographics. And this pilot project ended up garnering a lot of media and also a lot of conversation about what is the responsibility of a platform. Are the tools agnostic? So this is a philosophical question that is often brought up in these spaces. You'll have a lot of people who will argue the tools are agnostic, it's just the tools, and we can't be responsible for what people do with the tools. But what we were seeing is that this ecosystem that was being created was actually making a toxic environment so that not all people could participate. And that if participation is power, which our Constitution said, then we need to make sure that everybody has a right to be heard. And as a result of the media coverage, as a result of the support that we received, Twitter did, over some time and some negotiations, respond. And we became a part of Twitter's Trust and Safety Council. And so now we hear about upcoming product updates and different tactics that they're going to use to counter these issues, and also get to weigh in addition to a lot of other partners. We're also in partnership with other organizations like Hollaback, whose director is here in Ottawa right now speaking at another event on this issue, which I love, the synergy. And they are really doing a lot of work around bystander intervention. So that's another tactic when coupled with our solutions-driven research, as well as the flip the script, direct action organizing, that can be used. And as an advisory council member of Hollaback, I was able to help inform HeartMob, which is a tool that they've built where any of us can help support people who've been harassed. We can take action by helping people report, helping people with some love and support throughout the trauma of experiencing harassment, and also by agreeing to share our stories with others to help raise awareness about the issue. So another thing that we learned that is now a big focus of our work is about intersectional data. And this is a new sort of terrain that we're digging into because we, as a nonprofit, a scrappy nonprofit, need to develop more resources to really get into this. But we learned from the Twitter project that we actually had reductive data. So even though the data we had was really important to talk about how women were being disproportionately targeted, people of color, people with disabilities, queer people, immigrants, Jews, Muslims were being targeted, and those intersecting identities play a role in terms of how much harassment a person receives and the level of egregiousness in which they receive it. So for example, I will say that a lot of the harassment that I receive is both racist and sexist. And then some of the people who've done enough time to Google and stalk me online and learn that I grew up in Saudi Arabia will also attack me with Islamophobic harassment because they don't know about my religion, but also because they make that association as well. And so that would be one example of how there is a need actually to capture the ways in which multiple identities are affecting who's being targeted and the egregiousness of those attacks. And one of the reasons why there needs to be a third-party audit to do this work is because currently a lot of the tech companies say, well, we can't actually fix this because our data is proprietary, so we can't share this data, which I have a lot of feelings about because I'm now working on organizing shareholders who can compel them to share this data with them and then in turn help hold them accountable, which is another tactic that can be used. But the reason that people kind of shy away from doing this with third party is that intersectional data is messy data. It's harder to get. And when you're working with communities who are being targeted, we also need to be really careful about surveillance tactics and collection to make sure that we are not also reinforcing harm by collecting data in ways that put communities more at risk and compromise people's privacy. An example of that would be also some of the work that our organization and our coalition with Magnet has done with the Center for Media Justice to hold Facebook accountable for surveillance of protesters in Black Lives Matter, as well as accountability as it relates to Corinne Gaines, who was an African-American woman who was killed by police, and Facebook made the decision to take down the Facebook Live video of that surveillance, which is another example of how a decision was made then, but with community standards. are different when it comes to other forms of harassment for marginalized groups. So another thing I wanted to talk about too is that we talked a lot about disruption, but I also want to talk about how we can engage with media in partnership. And so that's another thing that we've used tactics around flipping the script and direct action accountability, but those relationships can also change and be fluid once organizations are educated. Doesn't mean we're going to stop being righteously accountable, but it does mean that when organizations are doing good work, we want to support that work too, because our goal is really about transforming the media landscape, making safe space for all of us to speak. So here's an example I wanted to share of The Guardian UK. I don't know if any of you read it. It's one of my favorite outlets to read. And The Guardian took it upon themselves to actually do a series called The Web We Want that focused on online harassment. And they did their own research, which is amazing, where they shared their own data. They shared the data around who the writers were at The Guardian who were getting harassed the most. And it should be no surprise, especially after what I said, that the people who are getting harassed the most were women and the people of color who were working for The Guardian. And those were the people who were getting the most violent and egregious forms of harassment too. And so as a part of this work to end online abuse and to also shine the truth to the light, they identified the problem and they talked to people who were doing work globally to end it. And so I was one of the people they talked to, and I spoke with them about the need for intersectional data as well as algorithmic equality. And there were other people like Michelle Ferrier, who works with Trollbusters, who was there, and Randy Harper, who built the Gamergate the Gamergate blocker, auto blocker. So you could block all the people who'd been harassing a lot of the people who had brought forth Gamergate, and then you could hold them accountable by blocking them and also protect your sanity and speech at that time as well. And so what was great about this is that they took away the normalization of saying that this was a censorship issue and actually showed it and presented it as a press freedom issue, which I think was really important when coupled with former President Obama's declaration that this was also a public safety issue, so that we could really highlight why this is an issue that everyone should care about, not just people who've been targeted and harassed. Around the same time, we met with Google Ideas, and you'll see some people here like Anita Sarkeesian, Randy Harper, who I just spoke about, other amazing people who are working to fight cyber exploitation as well. And we talked to them about what Google could do and what strategies could be brought forth within the tech community in general. And this was a really great conversation because we were able to actually go to Google and have a partnership conversation and talk to people who had real expertise and also power to make changes. Another thing I want to share about this, which is also the flip side, is that just a simple tweeting of this photo when we were all out together after the meeting ended up resulting in an onslaught of online harassment and an avalanche of criticism. And what was so great about that was that as we started watching the tweets pour in and all of the hate, we thought this is the best case for why this work is important. Because at that point, just because Google just posted this image, they were able to experience it and see it in real time for themselves. So one of the last things I wanted to say before we go to our distinguished panel is to just say that we are in a moment right now where there are a lot of problems and there's a lot of despair. But that is why we have such an opportunity to make real change, to hold real truth to the light in the midst of so-called alternative facts, and also to make sure that all of us can be heard so that we can really talk about the issues that are of import to our daily lives. And I wanted to mention some of the principles that came out of this work that I mentioned to you, to say that we think that all of the work and all the ways that we can take intervention and make interventions and interrogate this issue are important, and we don't want to have those lost in the tactics. So I wanted to name those so that in whatever ways you're doing the work, whether you're litigating, whether you're writing, whether you are helping as a bystander and joining Heart Mob and reporting for other people, that in order to achieve gender justice in media, we need to build inclusive movements and spaces. We need to mobilize the next generation and listen to young people. We need to make sure this work is sustainable, donate whatever you can to organizations like ours and other great organizations that are doing this work, who are trying to make spaces more safe for all of us. We need a unified strategy and vision. We need time to come together, like here and in other spaces, to figure out what needs to be done. We need infrastructure change. We need to put pressure on these platforms to make sure that women and people of color are not just in the junior level or marketing positions in those companies. That diversity and inclusion is at all levels of the organization, particularly at the board level, at the level of engineering and building and design, and also at the executive leadership level, where we're very alarmingly absent. Because the fact that we are absent is why this issue persists in the first place. We need a power shift. We need to be unrelenting in demanding that power is shared and that there is transparency around these issues and what organizations are going to do to create solutions to end them. And then also addressing barriers to equal access, participation, and ownership. So maybe our group is not the group that's being targeted this week, but we need to come together with radical solidarity to support everybody who's being impacted by this issue in order to end it for all of us. Great example of this would be Linda Sarsour, who was one of the organizers of the Women's March. Some people might have participated. This was a march over 5 million strong worldwide. I was in Washington, D.C. at the largest march in U.S. history that day with my pink hat on. And Linda Sarsour was one of the organizers, who also happens to be a Muslim American. And after the march, she was targeted with an onslaught of hate and threats and harassment, intimidation, not just to her, but to her family. And a lot of fake news, impersonation, and lies were being used to undermine her credibility and also her community. But the community came together and created a hashtag called I March with Linda, where people marched with her online in radical solidarity. People came together who had access to platforms like Facebook and Twitter and reached out to those platforms to make sure that she could become a verified user, which would allow her to have more quality control filters, etc., and more access to support on that level. And that brings me to the final one, which is expansion of capacity and influence. Those of us who have influence need to make sure that we lift as we climb so that we can help support each other when one of us is being targeted. Because when you attack one of us, you attack all of us. So now I'm really excited to hear what the rest of the panel has to say about how we can increase participation for everyone, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay. So obviously I have been doing work around games for nearly 10 years now. And very often when women start talking about games, they have to feel the need to validate the fact that they actually play games. I'm not going to bother. Just assume that I do and I know what I'm talking about. I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about games and why the work that we are doing towards equality, particularly around issues of gender, is important. So, we obviously know that technologies are always gendered, and in the arcade scene in the 70s, they were very, very masculine spaces, but the home consoles that were starting to go on sale at the same time were super family oriented. They were supposed to be fun for everyone, and they were supposed to be educational. And then one day, on December 7th, 1982, I remember this because it's the day I arrived on this earth, the industry leader, Atari, their stock plummeted and essentially ruined video games in a matter of one day. So games disappear, and I think I was born to ruin them for other people. So what happens when video games re-emerge with Nintendo a few years later is that they've decided they have to really recreate the audience. And that audience is going to be young. They're going to be affluent males with spare cash to buy their goodies. And so we start seeing things like the Power Glove and sort of really even things called the Game Boy. No girls allowed, right? So this was an invented audience. And about that time, so the mid-80s, we also start seeing happening what is called the hegemony of play. So we have this boy audience, these ready consumers, who are really the only people who are interested in going into the industry. So those become the ones who go on to train, join the industry, and make games for people just like them. And this has been going on for generations now, because like likes like. So what we're seeing since about 2010, though, is that women are actually playing games in almost equal numbers. More women are entering the industry. They're creating their own independent games and different styles of games that tell their own stories. And women are becoming much more active in vocal and criticizing the content of games, as well as the cultures, the toxic cultures of gaming. So the dudes who have owned this space for a really long time, oh, they are having a tantrum and a half because the women are here to take their precious toys away. So what happened in 2014 is kind of the genesis of what has become known as Gamergate. 2 articles were written declaring the gamer dead, demanding that the industry not need to think of just one ideal consumer and to create more diverse content for more people. So what happens is that, you know, there's some violence and vitriol against this, having like gamers' identity taken away from them, and like this precious thing that they adore being under attack. So they declare this as an issue of ethics in games journalism. Games journalists should not declare what games are and who they're for. But what it in fact was a massive coordinated attack on women who were involved in gaming, whether they were playing online, getting messages through the Xbox messengers, whether they were tweeting, whether they were producing media criticism content about games, or whether they were just working in offices and sharing their stories about like the toxic cultures within. A number of things have happened: doxing, death threats, people have had to relocate. Speeches have been cancelled in places like Utah because the institutions refused to cover the concealed weapons laws that happen there. So the speakers didn't want to be put in peril. Bomb threats have been called in. So I really think we cannot any longer pretend there's a difference between harassment and oppression online and in the real world. There is definite bleed and lives are affected. So what I'm working on right now is a project called Refiguring Innovation in Games. This is a SSHRC grant funded for $2.5 million over 5 years. Yes, they gave that much to a feminist project about video games. Thank you, Trudeau. This is at a university, and we have university partners. We also have community partners and a number of industry partners. There are struggles with working with them, which hopefully we'll get to in a second. Seed funding from this well of money goes on to support research and interventional projects. We have supported the creation of the LGBTQ video games archive to preserve the representations of different sexualities and gender orientations, you know, for the future going forward, and also to demonstrate that, you know, there are these stories out there and that we can see ourselves in this game format. We also support the creation and sustaining of informal learning spaces for women and women identifying folks to learn skills to make games within these safer spaces. Segregation is obviously not an ideal sort of sustainable idea, but in terms of getting women access to these technologies and skills, it is a really exceptional starting point. We also train people who work with these communities about working with vulnerable persons and the ethics of doing that kind of work and doing research in those spaces, particularly to protect their participants. And we've also been working with Feminist Frequency to create really accessible curriculum based on all of Anita Sarkeesian's videos about representations of women in games. And this can be picked up in informal or formal learning spaces. So basically, we're trying to work a lot on creating resources to sort of stand against or help promote women in the industry. Sorry, not stand against them. Stand against the harassment, but help women sort of prop them up in terms of getting into the industry or being included in play. I think it's interesting that you brought up the South by Southwest event. I don't know if this has anything to do with the Gamergate issue. Did it happen the same year?
It happened in the aftermath of it.
Okay.
But that was one of the parts that happened, is that some of the dissonance came from the fact that people thought we could have mixed panels with attackers and abusers,
Yes.
and people who were doing the work, and that's what led to the discussion about whether or not it was free speech or censorship to do that, and then we ended up having the other event.
It's basically disgusting. There were people who were going to go and talk about the harassment they have received from Gamergaters, of which Bannon is a major one. And so Gamergate were like, wait, we need to have our say. Like, we want to put abusers in the room with the people that they've abused. So I think there just seems to be zero education or knowledge that, like, it's not a two-sided, we need to get rid of that two-sided fallacy that your point of view versus my point of view, right? Like, this is not a debate. What you are doing is violence. So this is kind of all over the place, but I just quickly want to sort of wrap up with a couple of things that are tips that I've come across with dealing with online harassment. Is one, believe women's stories. It's not hard. Also, two, practicing ethics of care. If someone that you know is receiving an inordinate or just uncopable amount of harassment online, I've seen people who are like kind of taking up shifts to monitor their social network accounts in order to collect and all that evidence that they might need without, doing further damage to the person who is suffering. So ideas like that can be really, really helpful. And also something that I've noticed has been happening within feminist communities who are trying to address the gender inequity within gaming and the harassment issues is that there's this sort of policing of feelings going on when we really need to work together. And by what I mean by that is that in this private Facebook group, we were sort of having discussions about strategies about what we can do, but there was this blocking of people who wanted to share evidence about how this is happening in other areas. Like, this is what it's like to work in tech. Harassment exists in all these other places. And so basically, like, trying to validate their own feelings about, like, what is going on and sort of realizing it for themselves for the first time. But they were kind of getting kicked out of this group because they weren't in the right place. They were not yet ready to go to the social justice warrior stage. They were still trying to come up to terms with this themselves as feminists and as potential activists. So we can't be doing that to one another and sort of tearing one another down for where we are positioned when it comes to these issues. I've hogged the mic. Some for you?
A little bit.
Okay.
So that was incredible for both, hearing from both Jamia and Emily. Firstly, I think that it's incredible to have. So YWCA comes to this work through our work with girls and young women across the country, where we heard and learned what they were experiencing through them coming to programs at YWCA's, talking about reporting, talking about what they'd experienced online, sharing that information with teachers, parents, adults, and how they were treated at that time. And so we got funding for a project which we called Project Shift, and it's about creating a safer digital world for girls and young women. And it's really interesting because when we came to this work to look at the project overall, we started looking at other organizations that were already doing the work. WHAM, some of the work around Gamergate, all of that was just incredible for us. And so to be on a panel with some of these women is powerful, because I think that the work that you're doing at those tables, building those relationships, being our representative in the fight, I think is powerful, because we aren't there. I mean, I think in Canada this is we're having these conversations, and they've been happening in the US for about 10 years. And so that's really powerful. And to now hear talking about the conversations around intersectional data is also just incredible. So I'll tell you a little bit about why I think that's important. So at the YWCA, we do everything in terms of an anti-oppression and anti-racism. We use an anti-oppression and anti-racism lens, and we're feminists. And so what we hear and what we learn in our work is about stories, right? It's about women and young women coming to talk, to report, coming to shelters and sharing their experiences. And so what I have stories. I have incredible stories of what young women are experiencing online. So I have a story of a young woman who had a horrible experience where kids in her class had taken photographs used her photos from her online spaces, photoshopped them to point out her specific features. She's a black young woman, and when she reported that, and she talked about issues around shadeism, she had to find support from the YWCA staff to explain what shadeism was and why this is an issue, and that this is an intersectional piece, that it's not just about her being a young woman. This is also about race. It's also about the community that she's from. So these things are layered, right? And then there are other stories, these stories that we keep collecting of young women who are having these experiences. And so for us, it's not only about the why becomes about the mental health piece, right? About supporting young women who are experiencing this. And so the reason that we're doing the work, the reason you're in the fight, and we're there behind you to take up your back, your flanks, your six, right? Is because of that piece, and that so many of our youth and people who are experiencing online harassment is that it's degrading and it is deteriorating their sense of self. And I think that is really painful. And it's painful for anyone who's experienced it in the moment, but then it doesn't stop, right? It just keeps happening. There's no turning it off. So of course you need to have someone come in and watch what's happening in your spaces and supporting you. So I think that it's really powerful to be working in partnership with other women's organizations and other organizations that are there holding social media companies and software companies to account, because we're not there yet. And I'll tell you how we're trying to get there, but it has been a struggle. And so I can also eat up all the time, so do flag me. So a couple of really key things around Project Shift in terms of what we're doing. So yes, we did a needs assessment around gender analysis, and what we learned we developed some resources. We felt that it was really important for us to have resources to support young women so that they have a better understanding on what their rights are online. And so we have something called YWCA Rights Guide that has a lot of information, not only about that online spaces, but also everything that bleeds, everything offline too. It's all one world. It's not online, offline anymore. And secondly, we developed something called a Trusted Adults Guide with an organization based in Ottawa called Media Smarts, which is really about giving teachers, parents, adults, all of us who you've come to a better sense of what gendered cyber violence looks like and how to support that youth in a way that is non-judgmental, non-shaming, and non-blaming. The other big part of our work is around our information communications technology sector roundtable. So we've realized that we can't do this work alone. We are social workers in some cases and communications professionals, and I'm a teacher's college dropout. And so what we need to work closer together with people in the sector so that they can look at their practices and policies to better support girls and young women to creating a safer space for all. And so what that means is we have about 12 partners. Some of them are pretty big, so Microsoft, Facebook, but we also have some medium range organizations like Wattpad, which is an online writing community. We're working with a gaming company called You Can Games, with Kick, with a couple of nonprofit organizations like Ladies Learning Code, the Entertainment Software Association, National Capital Region Freenet, and the Information Communication Technology Council. And we've brought them together to look at how can we together start creating a culture of empathy within the sector. So, and secondly, looking at how can we be improving the accountability factor, and how can they be sharing resources not only within that group, but within the sector overall. And so together we're developing a training that will they will take on, they will pilot within their organizations, that looks internally at their structures, their reporting structures, looks at things like, are they looking at, do they have an anti-oppression lens when they're doing this work? Are they thinking about things intersectionally? And so that's really great, and we definitely want to feed and pass on information when that all happens. And so we're also developing videos because, again, it comes back to story. That is what consistently, whenever we've brought young women to share their stories of their experiences online, in gaming, etc., with the people who are in those worlds, it's incredible what happens. It's like, yes, the screen is down, this is the person. This is the person, pay attention. And they do, and it's incredible. And I wish that I could actually have panel after panel of young women who are youth who are experiencing life online in front of people who are coding, who are, looking at reports, who are doing everything. Because stop looking at that little tiny report, listen to the entire story, and now look at the numbers. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Dillon, and I work with the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women. We're a local organization. We're feminist, anti-oppressive, pro-choice, a lot like the work that the YWCA does, and we actually partner with the YWCA on a lot of these projects. So I'm not going to maybe go over a lot of the same kind of messaging that you've been hearing from other folks, because I think a lot of this is intersecting, and we collaborate a lot, and so we kind of come up with the same thing. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about some of the work that we're doing at Optiva, and then also I want to talk a little bit about dating apps, because that's just a whole other world. So again, this is coming from the funding from Status of Women Canada, and it's actually really interesting because Status of Women Canada, first of all, thought that this was an issue that was worth listening to. And it was interesting because a lot of the work that I was doing before this was on university campuses and looking at issues around rape culture and intersectionality and kind of the experiences of young women and other marginalized folks on campuses. And one thing that the campuses were really having a hard time with was this issue of online violence and gender-based online violence. So. And then what we came to realize is when, we were talking with frontline service providers and violence against women advocates and counselors who are working with women who are either surviving intimate partner violence or sexual assault, is that this is such a huge issue and that we don't know necessarily what to do about it. And it kind of hasn't caused new forms of violence, but technology has really kind of changed the way that violence happens. So that's kind of a place that we start from. At the heart of this project is young women. So there's a group of 8 or 10 young women from the Youth Services Bureau who have really been working over the last 3 years on this project with us. And so really all of the effort and work and brilliance that they hold is really at the heart of what we're doing. And I want you to consider the following, is that oftentimes when people are oppressed, they always resist. So I think when we're talking about these conversations, I think resistance is a really huge factor. And, when we're talking about what we can do and kind of moving forward, because we know that this is a problem, it's kind of what do we do about it? So we really should kind of hold resistance in the back of our minds. And I really like the name of this event, Open Participation is Power. Oftentimes in the feminist community, we talk about empowerment, empowering people, but I think we should just talk about no, this is actually just real power. So we also did a needs assessment, and a couple of things that we kind of came to terms with is that like the monolith of cyber violence has all these different kind of moving pieces. So the issue of online harassment is definitely one of probably the most like egregious from like a lot of what we're talking about. So whether that's like hate speech, doxing, trolling, like 20 different types of online harassment that we are seeing. We're also seeing like non-consensual distribution, so things like sexting, revenge porn, what happened with Rita Parsons, like that kind of stuff. The recording of sexual assault. So not only are people sharing these photos, but they're actually taking videos of like sexual assaults happening, and they're putting them on platforms. They're sharing them with their friends. So people are kind of consuming those images of sexual assault, and sometimes they might not even know it. There's a huge issue right now with online pornography sites having and hosting these kind of videos of sexual assault, and young people are consuming these things and they're not even really understanding kind of what they're consuming. And also the issue of intimate partner violence and the way that technology actually facilitates intimate partner violence. Like right now you can go onto the Google store and find things called girlfriend tracker, right? So why does the Google or Android store allow these kinds of applications to exist? Like why is girlfriend tracker allowed to be a thing? So that's kind of some of the questions that we're asking, some of the issues that we're seeing. One of the strategies that the young women came up with is that they really wanted to look at the 5 biggest platforms that are kind of like consuming their lives. So they came up with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and Tumblr, because those are the spaces that they're on most often. And what they wanted to do is create an online hub. So what we have is a platform called Tech Without Violence, and that is an accessible, responsive platform where young people can go to seek information, but it also holds recommendations and conversations around, what they feel like these platforms should do. So we kind of divide it into 4 different pillars around prevention, response, support, and privacy. So things like blocking in prevention, content filtering, which we kind of already talked about, a response in terms of the reporting mechanisms. So like why do certain things get escalated and other things don't? Who are the people who are looking over these responses and these reporting pieces? Support, what kind of resources do these platforms have? We've heard of different mechanisms where they filter different folks' like, sometimes you're on Facebook and you have a friend who like puts a status update and they're talking about their mental health, or maybe they're talking about suicide and stuff like that. And some platforms are saying, hey, like maybe, we should be kind of intervening, or we should be checking in with these folks, or maybe, as a community, what do we do about those pieces? Because that in my community, that's something that we see a lot. And then also the issue around privacy. So things like, your GPS locations, your data ownership, whether these platforms are encrypted, whether encryption is a good or a bad thing, because that's kind of a conversation that is ongoing. And then also just understanding like the real impact of trauma in terms of when we're talking about these things. So a lot of the times, we hear this conversation happening a lot around cyberbullying, but really like something that I feel like the 4 of us are really trying to get forward here is that it is a gendered issue, it is an intersectional issue, and it does have real systemic impact. So, and if you keep in the back of your mind that like not only are these people experiencing these things online, but it's very possible that folks are also surviving other kinds of forms of violence. And like, what does that mean? What does it mean if you were sexually assaulted and you're also experiencing online harassment? What does that mean for trauma and your healing and what we can do about that? So that's kind of something that we should also take into consideration, is that trauma is real, and that this type of violence is real, and it has really devastating effects. And also just the ways in which we engage in these online spaces, and how, algorithms and platforms, they're not neutral spaces, right? Like I think we often go on the internet, we're like, oh, the internet is neutral, but it actually isn't a neutral space, and we kind of need to engage with that kind of line of thinking. So in terms of the dating applications, I think dating applications are like a really interesting, but also like a really scary, terrifying, like horrible place. I don't know, like I went on Tinder like very briefly, and just as a person who's gender nonconforming, to be online in online spaces is a really interesting experience, because it is so gendered and is really structured around the gender binary. But some of the stories, like we had a focus group with university folks last year, and they were talking to us about some of the issues that they were facing on these online dating spaces, and what we're seeing in those spaces is just kind of completely like another world. So oftentimes we're seeing like how these platforms are architectured in ways that incite violence, and that, dating apps can be a really overwhelming and awful experience online, particularly for young women and other folks from marginalized communities. The Pew Research Center did a study that, basically over 70% of women or other folks, marginalized folks, are experiencing harassment in the online dating spaces. But it doesn't just stop there. There's issues around rape culture and misogyny. So I don't know if anybody has followed the like Buy Felipe hashtag. Yeah, if you haven't checked it out, you should really find that. And the whole issue around like I don't know. I was reading this blog. It's like called The Crisis of the Dick Pic, which I think was like really, well, funny for a name, but this is kind of something that young women are telling us, like that kind of non-consensual, like just sharing of those images and, what do you do about it? But also like the racism, like some young women were telling us that in a way you can filter out exactly to the level of diversity you want. When you swipe no on, people of color, on different folks in the application, the algorithm actually like you stop seeing them after a while. So in that way, the algorithm isn't neutral. Homophobia and transphobia. There's a lot of trans folks who are having their profiles reported. They're being flagged off of those platforms. They can't participate in the platform just for the sake that they are trans. People living with HIV are having to navigate disclosures and just being in stigma on the platforms. People who experience different levels of ability. First of all, we don't see people living with disabilities as sexual beings, but also like, what does that mean to be in an online dating platform where you have to constantly be disclosing your ability or the photos that you're doing. So that's just kind of some of the issues that we're seeing in terms of the dating app stuff. We also seeing like the ways that it facilitates group sexual assault, suspicions of child abuse. There's just a whole kind of black hole of things that we do, and there's also technological solutions. Like Bumble came out with a way that women can only initiate conversations. There's another app called Bay, which is for people of color to go on and to find hopefully a more safer space. So so that's just kind of the stuff that we wanted to talk about a little bit about the dating apps. I'm very conscious of time too, so I'm just going to kind of like stop it there. But I'm going to leave you with one small story of hope. Is that I was living with a couple of 12-year-olds, and one of them sent a dick pic to the younger sister of their friend, and she was not okay with that, obviously. And then he turned around and called her a slut. And then so all the other 12-year-old boys who were friends with him stopped talking to him until he like took accountability, which I thought was really cool. So like 13-year-old boys, they're kind of figuring it out too. So yeah. Anyways.